Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Simon Lichter, co-creator of Scholar Circle with Chai Mitzvah and founder of UrbanDoor.org. Tonight's Scholar Circle program kicks off our new series, Ink and Intent, where we dive into the meaning behind political cartoons. This evening, Dr. Shel Horowitz joins us on exploring how differences in strength and casualties are used to vilify Israel. Chai Mitzvah is a national organization now celebrating its 16th year. They are the sponsor of Scholar Circle and a Jewish resource center that focuses on building community through Jewish engagement programs. They have over 20 curricula tailored for small group conversations for teens, adults, lay or professionally led. For more information, please visit their website at chaimitzvah.org. The Scholar Circle program was inspired by Scott Shea. Scott is the founder and board president of Chai Mitzvah, who authored a best-selling book, Conspiracy U, A Case Study, which unpacks anti-Zionist conspiracy theories from the left and the right political spectrum. You can purchase Scott's book along with an accompanying curriculum, which has been taught to hundreds of college students and others for only $18 on chaimitzvah.org. The curriculum was taught in a recorded series by Dr. Andrew Pessin, also one of our Scholar Circle's presenters previously. You will receive all this information in our follow-up email as well. The Scholar Circle hosts lectures by prominent scholars every 2 weeks on topics relating to Israel and the Jewish community, geared towards rabbis, educators, and lay leaders who are charged with explaining the complex issues the Jewish community is facing. A recording of each lecture will be accessible on our website and shared with you through email. We're excited to continue the Scholar Circle program, and we need your support. Scholar Circle has engaged over 3,000 participants since 10/7. Your donation will enable us to continue bringing international scholars to you at no charge to share their expertise on the evolving Jewish world in the aftermath of October 7th. Please help us reach our goal of $40,000. To make a donation, simply go to chaimitzvah.org and click on the gold menu tab Scholar Circle, select Support Scholar Circles. This will be included in our follow-up email as well. Thank you for considering supporting this engaging program for all. Our featured scholar is Dr. Shel Horowitz, who is professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. His research has examined international ethnic conflict, the politics of international trade and finance, and the politics of market transition and institutional change. He is the author, co-author, and co-editor of 5 books and over 50 academic articles. His current research interests include ethno-territorial wars and Chinese politics. He also regularly visits Israel. Before I welcome our scholar, a couple of housekeeping items. To submit questions, use the Q&A button on your screen on Zoom. The lecture recording, again, will be sent to your email in a few days and will also be available by next week on our website at chaimitzvah.org. Now to Dr. Shel Horowitz.
Thank you very much. Just share my screen here. Okay, thank you all for coming. And tonight we're going to talk about methods of attacking Israel in the information space, especially the most common ones, I believe, that we see now, which focus on differences in strength and casualties in Israel's conflicts with its enemies. So the argument essentially is Israel is stronger, therefore Israel is in the wrong, is a brutal oppressor, or Israel suffers fewer casualties and less destruction in these conflicts than its enemies, therefore Israel is in the wrong. And I'll talk about the faulty logic and evidence behind these arguments. And then we'll try to briefly talk about the more difficult question of how to respond to these arguments. And the approach that I'll take follows this cartoon here on the lower right, which is a famous pro-Israel cartoon. And the point about it that I like to emphasize later on is that it compares Israel with its enemies and focuses on the differences in the goals and the methods that they use. So I think that is a key means of representing Israel in a more accurate way and defending its rightness in this conflict. So just to review these cartoons, the 2 anti-Israel cartoons in particular, the one of the the person with a slingshot wearing a keffiyeh shooting his stone at a giant tank. Okay, so the message of that one is might makes wrong. Israel is a kind of vicious monster. So Israel's enemies are harmless protesters, or they're some kind of weak paramilitary forces. They don't represent a significant threat. Israel is this Star Wars style evil empire with overwhelming military force. Okay, the second cartoon is saying Israel is in the wrong because its enemies suffer more casualties, more dead in the conflict than Israel does, and they suffer more destruction. And these points of view are reinforced constantly in the mainstream news, especially in the 10-7 war, the second one about differences in casualties. So the thing that you see relentlessly are news articles, usually produced by the wire services like AP and Reuters, which are used by almost all newspapers and websites and so on that provide information. And they relentlessly repeat casualty differences. There are over 50,000 Palestinians killed, and that happened after only, quote unquote, 1,200 Israelis were killed by comparison. And the only thing they'll sometimes say, in addition to that, to somewhat moderate the implication that Israel is almost 50 times worse, is that the Gaza Health Ministry, they don't usually say the word Hamas, says, gives these casualty figures, but it does not distinguish between civilian and combatant casualties. So this kind of framing that is just looking at the strength of the two sides or the differences in their casualties is rarely used to judge who is right and who is wrong in other conflicts, including in conflicts involving the United States. So it's a tactic which is used mainly for Israel. And again, like I said, used relentlessly and repeatedly. So the benefit of the pro-Israel cartoon, which I'll emphasize as a response to this, is that Israel cannot be considered in isolation. Israel should always be examined relative to its enemies. And the message should be Israel wants to coexist. Israel wants to live in peace. Its enemies want to destroy Israel. Methods: Israel wants to minimize civilian casualties, not only its own, but its enemies, whereas its enemies want to maximize Israeli civilian casualties and are happy for huge numbers of their own civilians to be killed if this advances their goals. And another point to be made in connection with that I'll come back to later is that these goals and methods are not just used against Israel, but they are being used against all of the other enemies of Israel's enemies. And so they all face the same onslaught. Okay, before I start to get into some specifics about the faulty logic and evidence, here's just some gut reactions to these cartoons. So Israel's enemies are insignificant and harmless. Israel's enemies include most of the Arab world and also powerful non-Arab countries like Turkey and Iran. So, for example, Egypt's population is 115 million, Iran's population is 90 million, Turkey's population is 85 million, Israel's population is around 10 million. So this gives you some idea of the disparity and the constant, potentially overwhelming threat that Israel faces, even as it manages to defeat attacks or threats that take particular forms. The initial cartoon, which just shows differences in destruction or casualties as implying that Israel is in the wrong, the cartoon on the right shows, what I think most of our gut responses is that the way that Israel's enemies fight force Israel, despite its best efforts, unavoidably in defending itself, to kill a certain number of civilians. But the fault for those civilian casualties overwhelmingly lies in the way that Israel's enemies fight the war. So it is not how many casualties you have, but it's your goals and the way you fight the war that are important. So let's talk a little bit now about the argument that the stronger are morally inferior. So logically speaking, why does this not make sense? So if you're weaker than your enemies and your enemies have predatory goals toward you, if they want to destroy you, then being weaker is suicidal. So the logic of the argument would be that Israel must commit suicide in order to be morally superior to its enemies. Is being the reverse. Is Israel being stronger than its enemies? Does that make it wrong? Is being stronger wrong? We do not apply these arguments to other conflicts. For example, were the Allies wrong during World War II because they were stronger than the Axis? Would the only way for them to have been morally in the right, would that have been for them to lose World War II? So logically speaking, being stronger does not mean that you do more wrong. It just means that you have greater potential to do wrong, while being relatively weaker means you have relatively lesser potential to do wrong. But as we all know, the relatively weaker have a huge ability to do wrong, and we see that over and over again. And similarly, we see many cases of stronger countries not using their strength to do wrong, but for the most part to do the right thing. When weaker countries, the last point, start and continue wars, what does that indicate? It indicates that they are ideologically extreme in their goals and methods. In other words, they are willing to start and continue to fight wars which they are likely to lose. It means they care more about their goals than about the potential downside risks and costs of fighting losing wars. And very often the weaker party starts and continues the war because it faces a more moderate adversary, which will not use its often greater strength in an unrestrained way. And so that makes it easier to attack a stronger enemy and do a lot of damage despite being weaker. What about the evidence about relative strength? Israel has grown stronger in order to survive. If Israel had not grown stronger, it would not have survived. It will not be able to survive if it does not stay stronger. As we talked about in looking at those maps a couple of slides ago, the potential power of Israel's enemies is gigantic. It includes all the major powers in the region, supported by other major powers and ideological movements outside the region. Whenever Israel deals with one kind of threat to its existence, other threats to its existence develop over time, and Israel has to innovate and deal with those new threats, such as the missile threat and the nuclear threat from Iran in the recent times. Israel's goals and methods compare well to similar states and similar conflicts. This is something that I went over in more detail in an earlier presentation, despite facing much greater threats. So we can compare Israel to the United States, for example. We can compare the way Israel fought the War of Independence at around the same time to the way the United States fought World War II or the Korean War, or we can compare the way that Israel fought the 10-7 war with the way that the United States fought the wars after 9/11. The United States is one of the most upstanding moral powers in the world, but Israel still compares well to it despite facing far greater threats. By contrast, Israel's enemies are among the worst actors in these types of conflicts, despite the fact that Israel wants to coexist and compromise with them. Israel's best enemies, such as Jordan in the War of Independence, where they have controlled areas where Jewish civilians lived, have either killed or expelled them. Israel's worst enemies, such as Hamas in the 10-7 war, of course, have sought to exterminate Jews in areas that they control. Okay, is it wrong to have fewer casualties now, logically speaking? Okay, now supporting the side that has fewer casualties is not wrong, and it is not a double standard because having fewer casualties doesn't make you wrong. If it did make you wrong, if only having more casualties made you right, what would the implication of that be? It would be that the reason why Israel is wrong is because in its wars there have not been enough dead Jews. To use the phrase that Darrell Horn used, the author in her book, people love dead Jews. That is, they think it's moral for Jews to be killed en masse, but not for Jews to defend themselves in an effective but moral way. Israel's enemies aren't even satisfied when comparable numbers of Jews are killed in wars, such as occurred in the War of Independence, because their goal is the total destruction of Israel. So are we saying that we need to commit suicide then in order to hold the moral high ground relative to our enemies? Of course, no one would accept that argument. So the goals and methods of a country defending itself as they affect casualties should not be compared to standards of near perfection. This is the approach which is used to criticize Israel. In other words, there are simply too many killed in Israel's wars of defense. But it should be compared to other actors in similar conflicts, both those that are more moral actors like Israel and those that are less moral actors like its enemies. And you cannot ignore the potential costs of losing these wars or of fighting them ineffectively. So potential casualties or threats are important, and they justify fighting wars, which unfortunately result in enemy casualties. Let's look at some evidence from the 10-7 war. So the big point there, Israel seeks to minimize civilian casualties while its enemies, including Hamas, seek to maximize the civilian casualties of its enemies and are happy to take unlimited civilian casualties of the civilian casualties of their own civilians if that advances their ability to destroy Israel or their other enemies. To quote the urban warfare expert John Spencer, Israel has implemented more precautions to prevent civilian harm than any military in history, above and beyond what international law requires, and more than the United States did in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So this quote is praising Israel or justifying Israel's method of fighting by comparing it to the way that other militaries fight similar wars. So this is the correct way to make a judgment. Hamas, as we know, intentionally persists in fighting among civilians. People often say, well, Hamas could just surrender and no more Palestinians would be killed. But one could also make the more limited point, of course, that Hamas could merely designate areas of Gaza that civilians would be able to flee to that it would not contest. And then civilians would be predictably safe in those areas, and there would be virtually no civilian casualties in the fighting, as there were virtually no civilian casualties in the fighting between Israel and Iran just recently, because most of the targets were military targets that were not in heavily populated areas or could be struck at least without killing significant numbers of civilians. So Israel would have done that also in Gaza if Hamas had allowed it. And of course, we know the example for the issue of food aid, the humanitarian situation. Again, the reason that there are any problems at all is because Hamas steals, hoards, and resells the food as a way of keeping itself in power. There would be no issue whatsoever with feeding the population if Hamas simply allowed it to be provided with food without interfering with the process. So how do we fight back against this propaganda onslaught? It's very difficult to do. I don't have any kind of magic bullet answer, and this is something that we all need to brainstorm about, and the experts have to figure out how to do this in their own ways. But we can talk about the nature of the challenge and just mention some ideas. So again, most media discuss the 10-7 war primarily as a comparative body count, and Israel's enemies accuse her of genocide just because there are significant numbers of casualties, even though they don't use that criterion in any other conflict. In other words, there are 56,000 people, let's say, including combatants that have been killed in the war between Israel and Hamas. Do they go around and accuse any country responsible for 56,000 or more deaths of committing genocide? Of course they don't. So they have little or nothing to say about Hamas or Israel's other enemies or about other states involved in similar conflicts. So this type of coverage is reserved for Israel, and I think it's especially damaging in those types of supposed news reports that I mentioned put out by the wire services, which merely support body count, which merely, report body counts as if that is a reasonable way of judging who is in the right in a conflict. And this is going to continue because for Israel's enemies, this propaganda is part of their larger war against Israel. The reason why they fight this information war is because it is a crucial front in the larger war against Israel. And most importantly, what they intend to accomplish is to achieve military and economic embargoes against Israel from the outside world, which will weaken Israel to the point where they can more easily destroy it. So that is the primary objective of the information war. In terms of the larger conflict that Israel is involved in with its enemies, the coverage mostly ignores the enemy, whether its goals or the threats that it represents to Israel, or even in many cases, the methods that it uses. It focuses on enemy demands and grievances, which are not the maximalist goals that the enemy is actually pursuing. In other words, they will focus on the supposed goal, for example, of a Palestinian state, when that is not the goal of Israel's enemies. Israel's enemies want to destroy Israel. They don't want a Palestinian state. Palestinian state is only a means to the larger goal of destroying Israel. So now, what are some guidelines for how to fight back in this propaganda war? So we're not going to convince Israel's enemies by rebutting their arguments or making counter arguments. So we need to aim at supporters. That means develop our own knowledge, our own ability to communicate with each other and to put out effective information. And the major audience that we should focus on are those that are relatively uninformed. And those people can be convinced, for example, that Israel is not committing genocide, that Israel wants peace, and that it's Israel's enemies which are responsible for these wars and for the costs and casualties of these wars. So to do so, we need to not only defend Israel, but we need to counterattack, meaning describe Israel alongside its enemies. So that's the cartoon on the lower right again, compare Israel to its enemies. It's sometimes difficult to try to counterattack or defend against an enemy that uses the shrillest, most exaggerated lies to attack you. So it's hard for people very often to bear up under that, but it's necessary. And in practice, it's actually easier to, logically and with evidence rebut these kinds of arguments. Again, it's very important that Israel be compared to its enemies. Otherwise, Israel will just be compared to standards of perfection or near perfection and condemned for not fighting its wars without causing a single casualty among civilians, for example. It will be condemned on that grounds by its enemies. Another thing that Israel's enemies are trying to hide and which has to be highlighted is that this extremism that threatens Israel also threatens most of the rest of the world. So what are some possible ways or guidelines to do this? One, again, is to compare Israel to its enemies in terms of their goals, methods, and threats. So refute the slanders about Israel with facts about Israel, about the goals and methods that it has and the threats that it faces, about how Israel stands for peaceful coexistence and a more ethical self-defense that is an intent to minimize civilian casualties, even of its enemies. That Israel is not wrong because it's not perfect. That's not the right standard. It's almost always in the right because it is more moderate and behaves much better than its enemies do, both in terms of its goals and its methods, despite facing these far more fundamental threats to its existence. And again, to refocus the debate on Israel's enemies, not Israel itself. So Israel is not fighting Palestine. Israel is fighting the regional and global forces of radical Islam and the far left, as well as many regional forces that cooperate with them. And this is an extremely powerful and dangerous coalition. Hamas is a part of the Muslim Brotherhood, the global Islamic extremist movement, along with Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State, and Iran and its proxies. So if you are supporting Hamas, you are supporting this movement. Another set of Israel's enemies are the far left, a far enemy, you could say, but one which is at the forefront of the information war, which seeks to impose arms and economic sanctions on Israel in order to make it easier to destroy. So these groups threaten also the United States, the rest of the Western world, and most of the developing world also that does not agree with their goals. So how do we go about making these comparisons between Israel and its enemies? And how do we go about bringing home to those that are less well informed that Israel's enemies are their enemies? That's a much bigger a problem of design and messaging, and people that are experts in various areas, I think, can best figure out how to do that. But we can all do that in our own ways, I think. So I'm going to go ahead and stop there, and hopefully we have time for some questions.
Thank you, Shale. We turn to questions now. So we've had several questions come in. Through these political cartoons, it seems that populations are given different narratives. How do we combat these different narratives?
Yes. So the way that we do that is by making it clear that unequal standards are being used and that you have to be equal in the way that you apply standards. If you apply a set of standards to Israel, it would have to be applied to everyone else. And are you willing to do that? And for the standards that we are willing to apply to everyone, how does Israel stack up on those standards compared to its enemies? So it comes back to insisting on comparing Israel to its enemies. So for example, if we talk about the differences in strength argument, it continues to be almost miraculous that Israel is able to defend itself against such powerful enemies who are constantly attempting to refine their strategies and methods for destroying Israel.
Commenting on Derek Horn's "People Love Dead Jews," should Israel and Jews refer to the Holocaust more often? Since that number is 6 million dead Jews, would that balance out the public's point of view on Israel being quote unquote too strong?
I think it is important to stress that Israel's enemies seek its complete destruction, and this would involve a genocide. It wouldn't look necessarily exactly like the Nazi genocide. We wouldn't necessarily see gas chambers, but we would see mass slaughter like we saw in 10/7, but replicated all over Israel. And we would see a scale of suffering which is comparable to other genocides, including the Holocaust. So we certainly need to link the goals of Israel's enemies with the Nazi goals, not that they're Nazis, but that their goals are genocidal, and Israel must do what it takes to stop them.
Looks like we have time for about one more question. How come there is no mention of humanitarian help for the hostages taken by Hamas, but there's a lot of publicity about humanitarian help for the Palestinians?
Yeah, the treatment of the hostages is a difficult question. I think the main reason why the media does not focus on them is that unlike Israelis or Jews, it considers this to be trivial. So a few hundred people to Israel's enemies or to those that don't know very much doesn't seem very significant.
Hmm.
So it's hard to make them understand the ethos of Israel, which is that every Jew, not just every Israeli, but every Jew must be protected by the state, and it is the mission of the state to protect every Jew. Now, how to do that is a complicated question, and we don't have time to get into that.
Do you have any final thoughts to share about the political cartoons you shared and perhaps its effect on public opinion?
Yeah, I guess my final thought is that the emperor has no clothes. The reason why these kinds of arguments are influential is because they're rarely rebutted or they rarely have to face argument. As soon as you start to explain the faulty logic or the evidence of these arguments, I think most fair-minded people are going to see it if they don't already see it or if they don't already smell a rat.
Thank you, Dr. Horowitz, for your insightful presentation. Our next Scholar Circle features Dr. Saltzman, and the topic will be a special briefing and update on the U.S. and the Middle East on Tuesday, July 15th at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Thank you and happy 4th of July. We hope to see everyone soon. Thank you, Dr. Horowitz.
Thank you.